Okay, wow. If you hit that link, you are a straight up nerd. And that's okay. I'm a nerd. We're all nerds here. Welcome. And today, perhaps you have maybe gotten your hands on a Raspberry Pi. You found an old PC that you want to repurpose, or you're just interested in home labbing. Well, I've got good news for you because I'm going to go over two pieces of software that, as a home labber, you absolutely need to know, and in my opinion, should be on every one of your servers.
Did you just call me a nerd? Geek?
Yeah, nerd.
Okay, young home labbing Padawans, I get it. This seems intimidating. And I was super intimidated when someone first told me about the concept of, containerization and what all I needed to do and learn. I was freaked out. But once I did it, I realized it is super easy. So today we're going to be using my preferred platform. It's a Raspberry Pi. So this is going to assume that you are using some version of Linux. Raspberry Pi is based on Debian. I really want to just show you how easy it is, but also stress to you how important it is. So with that, let's talk about Docker and what it is. It's a containerizing engine. And simply that just gives you the ability to take your server or your computer and kind of cut it up into, for lack of a better term, little tiny microcomputers that you can host singular apps on. The concept here is that because they are contained, they won't interfere with each other when they're working on the same host machine. And because they're in their own containers, they can have their own dependencies, for example. So let's say you have one application that requires PHP 3, even though your neighbor container might be using PHP 4, and maybe your host machine's only using PHP 1. This gives you a really easy and efficient way to make sure that they're not stepping on each other and being able to apply different dependencies to each different container, even when it's different than the host. Portainer, on the other hand, is much easier to understand. This is just a GUI that sits on top of Docker, and it's going to give you the ability to manage your containers or your applications. Do things like restart, set policies, check on logs, delete them, add in applications. And then the other thing we're going to do inside of Portainer, lastly, is we'll install a new templating engine from something called Pi Hosted. And this is just going to give you kind of like that app marketplace where it's going to be a one-click install. And by installing this templated version, it's going to give you a lot more than what comes out of the box in terms of one-click installs inside of Portainer. So hopefully you got that. Docker, way to cut up your machine, apply different dependencies to them, and so they don't step on each other's toes. Portainer is just the overreaching GUI where you're going to manage all those things.
You must unlearn what you have learned.
All right, I'll give it a try.
No, try not. Do or do not. There is no try.
Okay, the first thing you need to do is navigate to pi-hosted.com. Now, this is actually from a fellow YouTuber. Shout outs to Nova Spirit Tech. And he is a phenomenal YouTuber. I'll have all his information linked down below, as well as this website. Now, he's gone ahead and made this a bit easy for us. And it's one of my preferred ways to install Docker and Portainer. So first and foremost, what we're going to do is install Docker. What this does is not only install Docker, but it will also install or make you, the person, the end user, part of the Docker group. And all that means is that when you install this as, let's say in my case, Pi or Hill, and I'm using Hill, then it's going to add Hill to the Docker group, which means that you can execute Docker commands. So let's go ahead and start off on this first command. If we go here and copy that, then let's go over, I'm using a Raspberry Pi, open up a terminal. If you're not familiar where that is, that's right here, and just paste this in and hit enter. This will take a minute. Once it goes through this, it will actually, as I mentioned, install Docker. And next, we need to move on to installing Portainer, and that is this first line right here under install Portainer. Go ahead and copy that, and we will move back over to here. One of the things we do before that is we actually need to reboot this, or at least log off, for it to kick in so that Docker is working. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick, and I'll be right back. And once again, just over here, just grab this first one. Now that we are booted back up, we're going to install Portainer. And if we put that here, paste, and that will take a minute as well. And once this is finished, we will be able to use both Docker and Portainer. Now, by default, this is going to install on port 9000. So what you need to do is just navigate. And if I check here, you'll notice that my IP address is 192.168.80.12. So if I open up a browser and I go to 192.168 128.80.12 and the 2 dots, forget what that's called, computer guy, not a English guy, 9,000, and we hit that, you will notice that we are now headed into Portainer. Now what you want to do is change your username to something other than admin. That's a bit of a security risk. Type in your password, hit confirm, and hit create user. I'll go ahead and do that off screen, and I'll be right back with you. All right, that'll bring you to the quick setup. All you need to do is hit get started. Once you're here, you'll need to hit, it'll say, let me disconnect that. It'll say live connect. So hit live connect, and that will take you to your dashboard. Now in the dashboard, the main thing we're going to be covering is containers. So on the right hand side, if I hit this container, you will see we have one container, and it's actually Portainer. So Portainer lives in a container. But as I mentioned, this is the GUI that you're going to be able to do a lot with. And one of the things you can do is come over here to the template engine, go to application, and you'll see we have about 6 pages of applications. Drupal, if you're not familiar with that, that is basically a content management system for building websites. There's a lot of different things. You can see it's labeled by different categories. If we go to monitoring, you can see there's a few there. But again, it's only 6 pages worth. So the other thing we're going to do right now is actually change this template system to point to Nova Spirit Tech's repository, and this way we'll get a lot more of those one-click installs. So in order to do that, go down the bottom here, hit settings. Once you go to settings, you'll actually see a URL right here. Now this one is just the one that comes with default, and that's what we want to change. So if we head back over to the Pi hosted website, if you scroll down below here, pay attention to your architecture. I installed ARM64 on the Pi, so I did a 64 Pi OS install. So according to this, I'm going to pick the ARM64. Go ahead and grab this, copy that. Now let's go back over to our Pi, and where it says app URL, you're going to paste that in. Paste and then hit save. Now if I go back to applications, templates, applications, let's see, did it not take? I might need to refresh it, stand by. So now I just had a category in there. I guess it defaults to that, but you'll notice we have 23 pages. So prior to that, we had 6. So this is going to give you a lot more options. So let's go ahead and use this to install a one-click application. Remember, this is going to deploy the container for you, and it's also going to deploy the application. So let's go ahead and pick a dashboard, for example. And what do I feel like? Let's just do Hemdall. And we select that. We can name it something different. I typically keep that the default. Make sure you keep it the default bridge. PUID, PGID, leave those as default as well if you do see them. This just is going to give you privileged user rights. Now, the other area I want you to pay attention to is show advanced options. This is an area you just want to be familiar with, because as you move downstream, you'll get more familiar with this, and you'll start deploying some things that you might want to alter. For example, ports. So if you look over here on the left-hand side, this is your host computer's ports. Now remember, there's a finite amount of these. There's a lot of them, but you don't want to have them conflicting with each other. So if you have one application that needs 702 or has 702 on it, you might want to change this to something else. Typically, you can leave them as the defaults, but there are some examples that I've run into where the defaults of 2 different applications were the same. I think it was like port 5000. So just remember, over on the left is where you're going to connect. So this would be 9000, right? So that's the host ports 9000. But then internal to the app, remember how I said they're kind of like little mini tiny computers in each container? Well, they also have a full range of ports on their side as well. So this is the internal ports, and I highly suggest you don't ever mess with these if at all possible. And just make sure you're careful when assigning your ports if you are going to mess with them. But if you can, leave them as default. Now down below that, you'll see something called volume mapping. Now volume mapping is just where it's going to save everything to, whether it's configuration files for the application itself or data that you're inputting into it. This is where you will find these. Now, as you get more advanced, you may want to change the area it saves things to, but I suggest as a beginner, just keeping it as a default, especially if you ever need to go out into the internet to look for some support articles. They might make assumptions that you're leaving things as default. So I would just leave it that way as well. And those are pretty much all the things that you really need to be aware of in terms of deploying. So after we get all this done, leave it like it is. We can hit deploy the container, but you want to make note that it's going to deploy on 702, 703. So let's deploy that. All right, it said success, and you can see here, we are actually in our container area. And this is going to list, as you notice, Portainer, what you just launched our first one-click container, that is Hemdall. Now it's going to give you a state, whether it's running, whether there's a problem, whether it's down. And next to that, you actually have a little document type looking thing. Now this is super important because this is actually going to give you your logs. So if we open this up, it's just going to give you some information. Let's see, I don't see no custom files found, done. I don't see anything here. It says container detected, installing, and it seems like it is up and running. Now it does give us up top here, a little more information. Sometimes it will list the port, but that's why I had you just make sure you remembered what it was going to be. But you can also check it over here. So if I go back here, you'll see this is the image it pulled, but then you can also see the published ports. So we're on 7202 if we want port 80. So let's go ahead and copy this. It'll be on this machine. So you're still using your local IP. So take the local IP, and then we are going to point it to that port. And just like that, I forgot it. It is 7202. So we'll go to 7202. And what we expect here, if everything goes right, is that we have just deployed, and we have. So this is Heimdall. This is just something that looks blank right now, but that's because this is a dashboard. You would add applications that you link to, so you have a one-stop place just to go to. I like this. I use something different in practice. I use Homar. The last thing I'll mention to you is if you click this, you can actually, there's two things that I should mention to you. Over here, if I click the word itself or the title, that's going to give me more information on what's going on. So this is going to be our environmental variables and some of our labels. This is just a good place, especially if you have questions as where it's storing things or what it's doing, or if you're trying to troubleshoot what's going on, you might need to change some of these values, but only if you research it and you have issues. Don't go willy-nilly in here. You will break things very easily. Now, in order to do that, you would come over here and hit edit. And then you could come in, you could edit the name. So just as it insinuates, you can edit whatever you want. But one of the things that oftentimes you will edit is either where your volumes are, where your environmental variables are, or if it has labels, some of your labels that you might want to change some of these things. So just know that's available, and then you would hit save, and it would actually redeploy the container with these new settings. Let's say you needed to come in here and change the port because you wanted to use a different port. You could do that and then redeploy the container. So it's just that easy to make changes. So that's one of another big advantage of using something like Portainer and Docker. So let's go back to those containers real quick. If you hit this, the other thing you can do is you can stop it, you can kill it, you can restart it, you can pause, and you can remove. So just as easy as we deployed, it's even easier to remove it. And we're going to go ahead and remove this really quickly. So just click that, hit remove. And then also I typically toggle this just to try to get everything off, and that's automatically remove non-persistent volumes. We want to just try to clean it up. So I'm going to hit remove, and it's going to go through it and it's going to do its thing. So just that easy to deploy and remove. So you can feel free to kind of do this at will. And it's a great environment to test in as well. You can see it just makes it really easy. Now that we've covered the install and you've got Docker and Portainer running, and we even installed a one-click application, you may find a application that you really want that's not listed. So if it's not listed in that repository, you're going to have to deploy it manually. So right now we're going to walk through the process of deploying a Docker container via the command line. Now this is pretty easy, but you just need to understand a couple different concepts. And with that, let's jump back on the computer. In order to deploy something manually, we need to create something called a Docker compose.yml file. And inside of that Docker compose file, we'll have information similar to what we saw on when we did the more options inside of Portainer when we deployed the one click. So this is going to be a lesson in how to deploy Homer. Now, I like to go to the website, in this case, homer.dev, and I look at their docs. Typically, they'll have a Docker installation, and it will give you what you need to put in your Docker compose.yaml file. So now that we have this up, let's go ahead and open up a command prompt. Once we have this command prompt, I'll make it a little bigger here for you all. And we are going to do this is what I like to do. Everyone has their different methods, but sudo bash, and that's going to get us into the root. So if we do ls, you'll see we have, what's in our home directory there. Now I'm going to do a mkdir, that's make directory, and I'm going to name it Docker. All right, now let's do ls, and you will see there that we have Docker. Now I'm going to cd Docker, and that's going to bring me into that folder. Now inside of this Docker, I want to create a Homer folder. So we're going to do the same thing, mkdir, and then we're going to name it homarr. So ls, check it's there. Now we're going to cd into the homar directory, and this is where we're going to create our Docker compose file. So in order to do that, you need to issue this command, sudo nano docker -compose.yml. And that should bring you up to something that looks like this, which is just a blank file. Now, if we go back to our Docker information, we're actually going to copy this stuff. So we copied that there. Now inside of here, pretty easy, the name of the application. This is actually saying the restart policy, which is always start it unless I stop it. And it's gonna create these volumes for us where it's gonna store the data. It's got an encryption key if you want to link it to some other things. And then most importantly, well, not most, but one of the most important things is to note that it's on 7575 on that port on this machine. So now that we have that, let's go back to the Docker compose YAML file, hit paste. So we have all that information there. Now we're going to write it to file. Once we do that, we do an ls, and you'll see we have the docker compose.yaml file there. Now, if I wanted to edit that, for example, I could just use nano docker-compose.yml. And you can see here, then I could edit this if I wanted to. So let's get out of here. So that's just to show you how to edit it in case we need to adjust some things. And sometimes you do. We'll see if this works. So now we need to issue a Docker command, which is just something that allows us to manipulate Docker and tell us to deploy this. So we're going to do docker compose up-d, and we're going to hit enter. So there you can see it is now running. It's pulling that instance down, typically from a GitHub repository, and it's deploying it for us just like that. So we were on port 7575, and we are going to check it in two places. So once it's deployed, which it is deployed now, we can take a look at it, and right off the bat, we should be able to get into 192, and it was, my memory's horrible, 72, or no, 75. And this should be, I have one extra in there. Boom. And this should bring up Homer. And it does. Let's change this. I can't stand light things. So you could log in here and you can see it's deployed. But we can also manage it and check for it over in Portainer. So 192.9,000 gets us back into Portainer. So now remember we deleted the other dashboard just to show you how to delete it. But let's go to Live Connect. So we should see two containers, and we do. One will be Portainer and the other one will be Homar. So that is how you install something manually. Multiple ways to do this. You can actually do it inside of Portainer as well. But still to this day, if I'm going to have to do something where it's not built in a one click, I'll do it in this manner that I just showed you. Well, you did it. You installed Docker, you installed Portainer, you deployed your first one-click application, and we went so far as opening up the terminal and installing a container, raw dogging it like it should be from the blinking cursor. We installed our own container manually. Woo! Bravo. Well done, I say. But now I'm going to throw a little bit of a loop to you. There are other solutions out there. We're not going to go into it right now, but I think it is worth mentioning. If you still are a little bit intimidated by this process, there are other alternatives, and one of those alternatives is something called Casa OS. Now, Casa OS, just think of it as like a more robust Portainer where you can do a whole bunch of things inside of Casa that you can't inside of Portainer, but it is built on top of Docker, as I mentioned, so it's still very reliable, but it's a little bit more easy to get around, and you can install multiple application marketplaces on it, so you can get like to, it's like 1,000 apps if you put them all in there. So it's very rare that I'm looking for a homelab application and I can't find it in Casa and I have to do it manually. So you're gonna have a lot more options there for those one-click installs, and I'm using it a lot more and more than nowadays than I ever thought I would. But I still think it's really important that you understand the basics of Docker as well as the basics of Padawan. No, I didn't mean that. Yeah, the basics of Padawan. You need to go do it the hard way first, okay? That's just a rite of passage to being a Padawan before you graduate. Boys, I think I'm cracking up. So I will have a video on this application, Casa OS, and feel free to like and subscribe. That way you have a chance if you win the lotto, and YouTube actually does a job and alerts my subscribers to my videos. Well, then you might see my next video on installing Casa OS, and you might be like, Hill, why'd you make me go through that exercise? But again, you're a Padawan and you need to learn the basics. It will serve you well. Take it from an unk, okay? Anyways, my name's Hill Phantom. I'll catch you guys next time.